Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 74 of SCOTONOMICS. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, very well. Nice to have everyone with us today. We've got a really interesting conversation with Bob Hockett. We actually had him on for a full hour, and the first half of the interview, we discussed his thoughts on America, and we were coming up to the debt ceiling and the crisis, and we also spoke about the problem with some of the big banks and what was causing them. We've actually got that just exclusive for our patrons, but today we've got the rest of that interview, which is a fascinating insight into Bob's thoughts on the financial services sector, corporate governance, and also we covered the central bank. So we asked Bob, if you were in charge of an independent Scotland, what changes would you make to those three areas? And it was really interesting to get his thoughts. And he was really keen, and he was really encouraged by our questions to give some really thoughtful answers. It was a really interesting opinion from him. And I think it's really important that we continue to get opinions from outside of Scotland and the UK. I think it really helps us have a much kind of fuller picture of the types of changes that we have to make to our economy. So that's my little summary. Kieran, do you want to give us a little overview of the fantastic Friday that we had together in Kirkcaldy?
Yeah, so that was really interesting. Roger Mullen, who I'm sure many of our guests will know, put on a celebration, of this tricentenary of the birth of Adam Smith. So we were treated to some very interesting economists and their ideas and their thinking. And also we were treated to some great music and also some poetry and Scots language. So it was a great event, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was fantastic. And we also had a venue visit for our new venue in Dundee for SCOTONOMICS. And we met with some of the local not-for-profit and community organisations as well. So we managed to cram a lot into the couple of days. But yeah, the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birthday was fantastic. I've asked them if we can grab the economics section from the event for a SCOTONOMICS special. So I'm just waiting to hear back from them. But it was a wonderful hour and a half long conversation, a real deep dive into Adam Smith, which I'm really keen to share because, you know, I wrote that article about Adam Smith that went out last week, and a few people were commenting saying, you know, he wasn't a political economist. He didn't mean this by the invisible hand. And we had a lot of those discussions with people who know a lot more about Adam Smith than me on the panel last week. So it'd be really good if we can give you that full interview. I said, fingers crossed. Well, thanks for your comments and your thoughts so far. Welcome to everyone on Facebook, YouTube, and also on Twitter. Now, the interview that we've got with Bob, it's about 35 minutes and it's fascinating, and actually motivated me to write an article about what's called vertical money, how banks create money, which is going to go out on our newsletter via the National tomorrow. So there's a real tie-in this week with the topic that we are covering in the newsletter and some of the things that Bob covered. Really, he wants to see a completely different type of bank and different type of financial services, and that really resonated, didn't it, Kieran, when we were speaking to him?
Yeah, and also today there was a great article by John Helgi Eggleston, who also came to the SCOTONOMICS event about financial services and banking as well. So I've shared that, so if people want to have a look at that too. I should also give a shout out to John Alexander, the head of Dundee Council, who was very welcoming towards us and who I think is going to support us at the next SCOTONOMICS as well.
Yeah, no, it was good to spend a little bit of time with him as well, and hopefully, you know, if you attended the event last year, you can see how much effort we're putting into this year. If you didn't, you can see how much effort we're putting into next year's SCOTONOMICS. We're building towards that with a lot of the content. But okay, over the next half an hour, wonderful interview with Bob Hockett. I hope you enjoy it, and please do comment, and any questions or thoughts, we'd love to see them. We'll see you in a bit.
Hello, Robert Hockett, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS. Robert Hockett is the Edward Cornell Professor of Law and Public Finance at Cornell Law School and Cornell University, Adjunct Professor of Finance at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business, and Senior Counsel at Westwood Capital, LLC. I'm not sure what that is. You can tell us. And you have formerly worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the International Monetary Fund. And your expertise is in corporate law, financial regulation, international and comparative law. So
lately I've been teaching a new course that I introduced to Cornell a couple of years ago called Public Finance. And so that sort of has me in the middle of the debates underway here in the US right now about the so-called debt ceiling. So I suppose that's another credential that isn't on the sort of Cornell web page at this point, just because it's a new course, but I imagine it might be somewhat relevant here.
You know, Kieran and I are now elected leaders of Scottish, an independent Scotland, and we've said to you, right, Bob, two things we want you to talk about here. How can we change our corporate governance? Because we can't do anything at the moment because that's the reserve. Westminster decides that. Do with our financial services sector reserved at the moment. So as an independent country, which one do you want to take first?
Why don't I cover them in the order that you just laid them out? So I'll start with corporate governance, or the corporate form, or what we might call the optimal sort of enterprise organizational form on the one hand, and then we can sort of turn to a sort of optimal financial system or banking system on the other hand. And I love the fact that if Scotland were to become altogether independent again, it would be able to sort of reformulate all of this on a sort of clean slate. And it could do so on the basis of some of its own finest traditions of intellectual development or intellectual history, even, right? The great thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, including Adam Smith, if he were properly read and understood, which of course he isn't in the US. And before him, somebody like Sir James Stewart, who was, I think, much superior to Adam Smith in his insightfulness into the relation between the polity on the one hand and the economy on the other, could be followed and could be treated as, in effect, kind of thought leaders in the reconfiguration that I would myself be inclined to recommend. Maybe needless to say, I'm a sort of a dyed-in-the-wool, die-hard James Stewart fan. If anybody sort of informs my thinking as much as Karl Marx on the one hand and Alexander Hamilton on the other hand, it would be Sir James Stewart. But basically then, what I would suggest is something along the following lines. First of all, you'd want, I think, to encourage as much employee ownership of business firms as possible, or at the very least, employee co-determination. In other words, I think every productive unit should either be owned by the producers themselves or should be, say, at least half determined in what it does by the producers themselves, along with any private capital that puts its money in to sort of help finance things. So that would mean then, best case scenario, labor-owned firms that basically then finance their operations with inexpensively afforded credit provided by the state rather than by private sector rentiers who just happen to be rich because they inherited their money. Or at the very worst, you let those rentiers who assist in the financing of the firm, let them have no more than half of the voting power on the board of directors of any particular firm, with the labor force of that firm basically electing the other half of the board. As we know, that latter model, so-called co-determination, has been common in Germany for a good long time. And I don't think anybody would say that Germany was any sort of slouch when it comes from, on the one hand, being materially productive, and on the other hand, sharing the proceeds of that material production much more equitably than the so-called Anglo-Saxon world has done. And incidentally, in this connection, there's a nice little nexus or link between Sir James Stewart himself on the one hand and Germany on the other hand. So because, of course, James Stewart came of age and came into his own at a time of great political strife in the British Isles, much of it strife between Scotland and England, he had to spend a lot of his life in exile on the continent. And he spent the greater part of that time in exile on the continent in what ultimately became Germany. And probably the greatest thinker in all of German history, apart from Karl Marx, namely Georg Hegel, took a lot of his own social theory from Sir James Stewart. And this is a really critically important influence that very seldom gets noted or talked about. But it's not like he just invented all of his thought from whole cloth, or that he just developed the thinking of Immanuel Kant. whose mother, by the way, was Scottish. But rather, he took a lot of his point of departure when it came to social theorizing from thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, primarily Sir James Stewart, but also, of course, Adam Ferguson and some of the other great Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. But anyway, that would be the first thing I would do. Second thing I would do is I would revise the limited liability regime back to something like what it originally was and what it was originally intended to be. So if you think about it, limited liability is a very strange thing. And indeed, it's a real outlier when it comes to sort of traditional legal culture, right? Most Western cultures think of themselves as cultures of accountability, right? You impose a cost, you pay for it, right? You cause a problem, you compensate for it. And that would include causing harm or facilitating harm by financing it, right? If I, for example, invested in a hitman firm called Murder Incorporated, and then eventually Murder Incorporated was found out by law enforcement officials and was prosecuted under a theory of criminal conspiracy, I myself would be counted a conspirator because I had helped finance the operation. Same goes for terrorist finance, right? If I contribute money to a terrorist organization, I'm not very well going to be able to escape criminal liability by saying, hey, I never pulled any triggers or, set off any bombs. All I did was provide money for it. Well, it seems to me the same ought to be true then, and indeed the same used to be true when it comes to civil law liabilities, like the harms that might be caused by a firm when it causes injury of one sort or another. And so it used to be the case, right, that if you financed an entity that caused injury, you were potentially on the hook to help cover the monetary damages that had to be paid out to compensate people for those harms, even if all you had done is contribute money to the firm. Indeed, that continues to be the law to this day in connection with general partnerships, right? If your firm is not incorporated, but is a general partnership, and it does something that causes great injury, even if you yourself were not personally involved in that injury, simply by being a member of or a partner in this partnership and a contributor, therefore, of human capital or financial capital or both, you will also be potentially liable. Well, then why did we ever introduce something like limited liability? Well, it's fairly straightforward, the reason for it. It was, in effect, a highly contingent and highly conditioned grant of partial immunity on condition that the firm that received it was doing some sort of public infrastructure work that had to be done, right? So you don't have a well-developed, say, state capacity yet, and you don't have state capacity to sort of do infrastructure construction, to do building, to do well digging or what have you. And that was the story basically in 18th and 19th century America, and pretty similarly over in the British Isles. And so what we did, what these polities did is they said, look, what we're going to do is we'll give you a partial waiver from any potential liability as a contributor to a firm like this, if that firm is doing something that the public needs, like building a bridge or digging a canal or what have you. And that is precisely why the first corporations had to file articles of incorporation with the Crown in Great Britain and with some state authority, typically called the Secretary of State in any American state here in the U.S. during the early 19th century. And in those articles, you had to state what the purpose of the corporation was. And that purpose had to be well defined, like digging this canal or building this bridge or establishing this poorhouse or this other, this fire department or what have you. And any firm that departed then from that narrowly articulated purpose could be deemed by a court of law to be acting what they called ultra vires, which just means in Latin, outside of their powers, outside of their authority. And what was the consequence if you did that? If you acted ultra vires or outside of your authority, what you did was you basically sacrificed the limited liability shield. You could now be held liable in your personal capacity for any contribution that you had made to this firm that had caused this injury. In effect, you'd be something akin to a criminal conspiracy. We basically got rid of all of that over the course of the later 19th century, as various corporate types managed to sort of bribe or cajole or threaten their state legislators into sort of broadening the kinds of definition of corporate purpose that would count in securing them the limited liability shield. And even that might have been able to be justified in the late 19th century insofar as it was still a world of sort of scarce capital, in as much as there was still insufficient state capacity to sort of finance wholesale the kinds of things that we as a public would need to be done. But obviously that world is no longer our world. At this point, all states have sufficient capacity to finance anything that they need to finance. And that means in turn that industrial capital or investment capital is not in short supply. If anything, it's an overabundant supply, as a multitude of financial asset price bubbles give us to see. And given all of that, there seems to be no reason whatever to continue to afford limited liability of that plenary sort that we currently extend. And so it seems to me we can return then to the idea of the public purpose corporation and say that only the public purpose corporation receives the benefit of limited liability. And then we define public purpose in a way that's actually plausible, rather than just like to include, oh, our purpose is to make money, which is not a purpose at all, really, not a public purpose, right? So that's the next thing I would do, right? The final thing I would do on the sort of corporate governance front. On the financial side, I would effectively do a number of things that would be complete complements to that. They would connect directly.
Let's finish on the corporate governance, because that's amazing. One thing I always found peculiar was this shareholder primacy that's in corporate governance. Would you have any thoughts around changing that or enhancing it or anything like that?
When you were explaining that, I really started to think about. I've always had this issue with investment, is that people hand over money to other people to invest for them, and they essentially give up responsibility. And obviously, we've seen with our problems with the climate that's been something that's really a problem. I think people have to view currency as a living organism, almost, that this is a thing that can do things, and they can do quite powerful things, and we should take responsibility, not just private actors, governments as well. Where is your money organism gone to, and what's it doing?
Yeah. So I think these two questions are both mutually complementary in a very straightforward way, right? The whole idea of shareholder primacy stems, I think, from the same set of facts on the ground that prevailed in the 19th century that don't prevail anymore. The same facts on the ground that accounted for the extending of limited liability as well, right? Essentially a world of scarce capital, right? A world in which capital was scarce. And this was also a world in which state capacity was stunted. And that's no accident. These are two faces of the same coin, if you'll pardon the expression or the pun. In essence, state capacity is non-capital scarcity. And lack of state capacity is capital scarcity, right? Because capital just is effectively state provided, state afforded, state undergirded, right? It's all capital ultimately comes, when you think about it, right, from the laboring population and the state that is supposed to be acting in its name, right? So this is a sort of a variation, I think, on what some people in the 19th century might have called the labor theory of value. It all comes from what we as people produce on the one hand, and then as administered by organs of government that we ourselves empower and that are meant to act in our names as our agents on the other hand, right? So as you develop state capacity, you develop the end of capital scarcity. And so you no longer have to bribe a few rich rentiers who have managed to accumulate a bunch of capital essentially by expropriating others, by robbing from them, by inheriting wealth from earlier people who robbed from them and what have you, right? You can basically sideline all of that stuff, all of that private capital. And that in turn means, right, that we can make firms and organize firms in the way that I was just describing and that I think we would all like to do. But in order to do that effectively, then we have to, I think, reconfigure the organs of finance as well and make them transparently public, because at the present time, they're all still public. It's just they're not transparently public, right? We proceed with this sort of, or under this illusion, to the effect that essentially the banks are all basically receiving scarce private capital from these private rentiers who, through their virtuous savings efforts and their hard work and their own productivity, have saved it. And then we're sort of bribing them to let us use it for various productive purposes. And that's not really what the story is here, right? All of this credit, basically all finance capital that we find out there in the productive sectors is effectively state capital, right? It's all state issued. It's all basically state disseminated. But we continue to sort of live with this fiction that sort of pretends that private sector depositors are the source of all this, so that we still have to bribe them in order to, talk them into letting us use or rent for a fee some of their capital, right? So it's very easy and straightforward to do this. And if anybody would like to sort of see some blueprints for how, a number of things that I put out over the last few years that I could recommend, the most recent is that book that I think you guys have seen, the one called The Citizen's Ledger, which is then subtitled, Democratizing Our Money and Democratizing Our Finance, something along those lines. Can't remember exactly what the subtitle was, but that's the most recent one. But other ones that I put out recently that are shorter and more immediately digestible include an article called Building Banks Better. There's another one called The Wealth of Our Commonwealth. There's another one called The Capital Commons, and then quite a few other works as well. But all of these basically just sort of show how to do it. And effectively, one way to sort of, a shorthand way of describing that is to say that, all right, what we do is we stop mixing private capital with public capital, right? And one way to do that in turn is to essentially establish a sequence or a series or a network of public banking institutions, and then all public credit extension, all extension of the full faith and credit of a particular sovereign, be it the sovereign of Scotland or the sovereign that is the United States, would come through those particular banks, which would then be operated on a not-for-profit basis. Insofar as they charged interest or anything of the kind, it would only be in order to mitigate the risk of loss at worst. And we might even think of them as being able to tolerate a certain amount of loss too, for the good of the public or what have you. But either way, you would do that way. And then any private capital holders who want to do investing would have to do it essentially through mutual funds, right? Basically institutions that don't make use of public credit in any way, but simply directly lend out the money that other people have put in. In other words, what I would say is we should make private sector banking do precisely what it claims to do, but that it doesn't actually do, namely, essentially transfer money from depositors to end users. And then when it comes to public credit money creation, which by far is the greater part of what banks do, or the credit that they extend, when it comes to doing that, don't let any private sector institution do it. Let only public sector institutions do it. That's pretty simple, right? It's pretty straightforward. And it provides us with some lovely rhetorical cover as well, in the sense that if some private sector banker were to object, or some rentier, some private sector capitalist were to object, we could say, we're simply making banks be what you claim they are, intermediaries, right? You're always telling us that these things are intermediaries of pre-accumulated, scarce private capital. That's not what they are now, but we love that you call them that, because that's actually a good idea for what they ought to be. So henceforth, all of your effing private sector banks are going to be intermediaries, as you've been falsely claiming for decades that they are. And the only non-intermediary financial institutions left, that is the credit generating and credit disseminating financial institutions left, are going to be public, because the credit itself is public. End of story. What could possibly be unjust or wrong with that? Absolutely nothing. And the only reason we're not doing it already is sort of related to something we were talking about before. In particular, you, Will, when you said, why do we even call them banks anymore? It's essentially a kind of a linguistic conjuring trick, right? Or a sort of, maybe not linguistic, but terminological or idiomatic conjuring trick. Basically, if these fat cat rentiers can get us to think and to continue believing, partly through the words that we and they use, that banks, as we currently find them, are intermediaries, well, then they seem legitimate. It seems perfectly fine. This is just rich people helping the rest of us be more productive, because we haven't been as prudent as they've been. We've been too profligate or lazy or unimaginative or stupid. And so they are kindly, sort of letting us rent their money for a while to do something productive with it. That's not what's happening at all. And so what we can say is, look, we love this picture that you've painted. We're going to make it true. and here it is. And that all grew out of the corporation work that I did even before all of that, because in effect, what I've always told my students in my business organization classes is that the corporation itself is a franchise arrangement. And indeed, what's even more ironic here is it is so clearly a franchise arrangement that we even used to have a term of art that we used, American lawyers back in the 19th century. We called it the corporate franchise. Right? It couldn't be more straightforward than that, right? In other words, the corporate form itself was a public-private franchise arrangement of the variety or of the character that I mentioned before, that we as the public would say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a contingent and highly conditional limited liability shield insofar and only insofar as you are effectively pursuing public projects, public infrastructure work, public works, in other words. And that's the sense in which it was a public-private franchise. And then from there, I moved to realizing, well, there's one kind of institution in the American economy that still looks a lot like what the original corporation used to look like, and that's the banking operation. They still have capital controls. They still have to be chartered in advance. They have to be chartered in order to exist at all. In other words, they have to be licensed, where corporations don't really have, other corporations don't really have to be anymore. And so it occurred to me that the bank is a sort of vestige. There's a sort of vestigial relation between the current banking operation in the US on the one hand, and what used to be true of all corporations in the US. And so in a way, one way of viewing a big chunk of my sort of intellectual project or scholarly project or whatever is as, first of all, drawing out the sense in which banks simply are a continuation of that old franchise arrangement and basically capitalizing on that fact. And then secondly, actually bringing back that arrangement to the broader realm of corporations as well. Right? A return basically to the 19th century when it comes to that.
Good to have some kind of quick fire ones now, thinking about a new Scottish financial sector. It's the finance sector in Scotland is a lot smaller now than it was pre-2008, but it's still significant. It's still a big part of the Scottish economy. In an independent country, would you see the finance sector, you know, banks and insurance and all that entails, would you see that being smaller, same size, bigger? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard for me to predict in advance whether in aggregate it would be larger or smaller, because my main focus is more on what you might think of as the sort of composition of financial portfolios rather than the size of the portfolios. And if we change the composition in the way that I'm thinking of, that might result in there becoming even bigger, or it might result in there becoming smaller. But more importantly, it would actually be a composition that was more focused on what it seems to me it ought to be focused on. And that, again, is material production, right? Essentially productive activity rather than betting or speculative activity, right? In other words, non-zero sum type investment, right? The thing about financial investment, of course, is it's zero sum, right? One person's gain is another person's loss. That's just how that works. That's why it's gambling. And that's one of the senses in which it's gambling. But when we're talking about productive investment, we're not talking about something that's zero sum. We're actually talking about the transformation of raw materials, the transformation of nature into more usable and human assisting forms, right? We're talking about the material betterments of our lives and in ways, of course, that are sustainable with a healthy environment and the like. And if we were to sort of be reorienting finance wholesale in that direction, and hence changing the composition of financial portfolios to more real sector stuff and less of this sort of financial sector stuff, over the long run, I think that would probably result in a growth to much larger sizes of those portfolios, because they would be essentially the financial correlate to an ever-growing material wealth base, right?
A bigger financial services sector, but it doing what banks should do and more function of providing support for productive capacity.
But this is the beauty of the vision of Sir James Stewart and of Karl Marx, right? The idea is that essentially a society grows ever more opulent, ever more wealthy, ever more materially comfortable, even to the point where we're talking about, you know, interplanetary colonization and the development of health services and health science to the point where we can live to be 200 or 300 years old with high quality lives. I mean, there's any number of amazing material possibilities that lie before us that we would probably already be doing by now if we hadn't just let a few rentiers be calling all the shots with what we do with our surplus, right?
And of course, keeping this all within our planetary boundaries being the ultimate constraint. We are talking about financial services. We're really talking about where the money comes from. So another question, if Scotland's independent and it wants to have a new use for currency and it wants much more state involvement, could Scotland do this as an independent country whilst using the current British pound and having the central bank in England as our central bank?
Yeah, I frankly think that Scotland would have to form its own central bank. It would have to have its own currency. And it might retain some kind of a loose connection to the Bank of England and to the British pound, just for the sake of not, I don't know, maybe seeming too radical, making it look like too radical a severance at one time. But essentially what you would need, I think, is full Scottish monetary autonomy. And that in turn would not be compatible, I don't think, with Mark Carney or whoever the forthcoming governors of the Bank of England are going to be, actually being able to determine or call the shots, right? I think, in effect, what you would want is to be able to engage autonomously in what I call money modulation on the one hand and money allocation on the other hand. That means you would have to be able to determine the quantity of money in relation to the quantity of goods and services that money can command. That's the modulatory task. And you'd have to be able to control direction in which the credit component of the money supply, which is virtually all of it, the directions in which it would flow. And you couldn't let the Bank of England be determining that either. So in that sense, I really think that you can't have a fully viable sovereign polity without having a sovereign currency that is issued and administered by a sovereign central bank, or by a central bank that is the instrument of your sovereign itself, of your polity of Scotland. And again, you could have some sort of, maybe call it, the Scottish Bank of the United Kingdom as distinguished from the English Bank of the United Kingdom, and then sort of, I don't know, symbolically make it look like they're allied in some way, and maybe have regular plenary meetings between both banks or whatever. Again, just so as not to look too radical or whatever, but as a functional matter, I think you'd want realistically for that bank to be autonomous and that currency to be its own currency.
Bob, we covered central banks there. Again, we've extended your brief now. It's not just financial services, it's and corporate governance. We're saying to you, what should our central bank do differently?
Oh, great, yeah. So I'm going to recommend another reading or sequence of readings to your viewers, because I'll be basically riffing on that. If anybody Googles my name on the one hand and the phrase "spread the Fed" on the other hand, they'll find all sorts of pieces that I put out that make use of that phrase, that slogan that I coined a few years back. They'll find sort of written versions of what I'm about to suggest here. In essence, I think the key here is you want your central bank effectively financing production, including new startup production, right? And the easiest way to do that is to offer what here in the US we call a discount window, where the central bank effectively, quote, discounts commercial paper, basically short-term credit, that's issued by productive entities. And if these were labor-owned and labor-controlled entities, then this would be even more exciting, even better. But in essence, what you do, the way this works, and this is the way the Federal Reserve System was originally meant to work, and then we stopped doing this in the 1930s. And so one of my biggest projects here in the US is to try to bring the Fed back to that original vision, that original system, which, by the way, itself comes out of Germany via the person of Paul Warburg and the German system of Landesbanken, that were all productive investing institutions. Basically, what you do is you say, okay, look, as any firm that is, wants to embark on a new project, or that is just starting up itself as a new firm that needs financing, what we'll do is we'll say, okay, you issue promissory notes or commercial paper of some kind, and show us your business plan. Explain to us what you're trying to sell this commercial paper in order to help finance. And if your projects meet our criteria, which will be essentially democratically determined criteria by the polity as a whole, If your projects meet those criteria, we will, quote, discount your commercial paper, meaning we'll buy it from you for some period of time. We'll pay for it, in other words, which is just another way of saying we will substitute for your private promissory notes our public promissory notes, which also count as legal tender, which means we're conferring upon you command over the resources that you need in order to see your project through. And obviously you don't want to do that for just any project that anybody cooks up, no matter how implausible, but anything that's relatively plausible looking and that looks like it would better the public or better our material lives as Scots, and that looks likely or at least plausibly might succeed, we'll go ahead and facilitate by essentially affording to you that command over resources that a currency in a monetary exchange economy amounts to. And it's just that simple. Right, and so note that that's both a modulatory function then and an allocative function, because you're being allocative through those criteria, right? You're saying, okay, only for projects that look likely to be productive, not speculative. That's the allocation part of this. And then obviously we're only going to issue money, as much money as is needed to monetize those particular pieces of commercial paper, right? No more than that, right? So basically every new unit of currency that is issued corresponds to some unit of borrowed funds that's going to be deployed productively. And that's essentially money modulation. You're saying we're not going to issue it sort of ad libitum or just without any sort of control at all, thereby sparking inflation. We're essentially modulating the issuance by tying it directly to production. And note that that is then counterinflationary, because in effect, what you're doing with that additional money that you're issuing is financing the production of the very goods and services that will absorb that additional money. And as you guys know, inflation is simply a relation, right, between money on the one hand and that which can be purchased by money on the other. And so an inflation is, of course, a case where the money is being issued more rapidly than the production is growing or expanding. And a deflation is a case where the money supply is not keeping pace with production. What you want is a Goldilocks, just right, sort of essentially a parallel growth, right? The money supply grows with the productive capacity. And the easiest way to ensure that is to issue it specifically in order to finance that growth of productive capacity, and no more than that, right? Then you don't have inflation or deflation. And at the same time, and a lot of the writing I've been doing lately, you've probably seen some of this stuff too, with titles like Scissors Require Two Blades, or Quantitative Easing Requires Qualitative Tightening, various pieces with titles of that sort that I put out there that are basically geared toward this major proposition, as I view it, that has been forgotten, that has to be said now. And that is that a central bank cannot discharge the modulatory function effectively unless it is also discharging the allocative function. And we've got this absurd myth in the US that we've had for a long time now, that the central bank shouldn't be picking winners and losers, and therefore we're simply going to modulate the money supply, but we're not going to allocate it. We don't want to have public sector institutions engaging in credit allocation. But the thing is, you simply cannot modulate well without allocating well. And that doesn't mean picking winners and losers in any micro sense, like, oh, we're going to get money to this Watts barbershop, but we're not going to send it to this pub in St. Andrews or something. It's not that. You just say we're going to allocate between productive and non-productive uses. And as long as what you want the money for is a productive use, not a speculative use, then we'll do it. And that's not picking winners and losers in any micro sense at all, just in a macro sense where you're saying we are not going to publicly subsidize private speculation, especially given the endogeneity of the credit money supply. And that's effectively what we have been doing in the US through QE for well over 14 years now, but really for about 30 or 40 years, since the Clinton era at the latest. We've been effectively giving as much money as they want, allocating, in other words, as much money as they want on very easy terms to purely speculative institutions. And that means we've had massive inflation, even during the so-called Great Moderation. It's just that during the Great Moderation, the inflation wasn't in the goods and services markets, it was in the financial markets. And we have another word for those inflations or hyperinflations. We call them bubbles. And once again, the financial sector is hoping that you won't notice that a bubble is an inflation, right? So that then they can say, oh, don't put any more money out there to employment projects or to public sector projects that would help raise wages or salaries, because that'll be inflationary. meanwhile hoping that you don't notice that sending them all the money has also been inflationary, but in a much more insidious and much more destructive way, because again, these asset price bubbles have been hyperinflations, not even mere inflations. We're not talking about 4% or 3.9% or whatever. We're talking about hundreds of percentages, right? Hundreds of percentage points.
It's only the wealthiest in society.
This has been a fascinating conversation, really fascinating. Thank you so
For me
much.
too.
Yeah.
Oh, of course, guys. Thank you so much.
To have that time with you.
Half would love it too. We'd love to be part of anything that you guys are doing over in Scotland, one of our favorite places.
Well, thank you very much to Bob for that interview. Some great comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts and views on what he was covering, but some great comments so far. And yeah, Helen, you're right. Helen Turner wrote, "It's so easy to follow. It's amazing." And he's a great communicator, and all the things, even the things that you read. There's a 77-page article he wrote about seeing banks as franchises. And that's really easy to follow. So he's a great communicator. Karen, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite clear to me that that's what's going on there. You know, the central bank licenses them. They also create money, just like the central bank. So for all intents and purposes, they are franchises of the central bank. And I think it was really nice the way he put it. We love this picture that you've painted, and we're going to make it true. You know, so again, I would say when I was first working in the early 1980s, the banks actually had to work for their money, and they'd have to make sound investments in companies that they judged to be a good bet, rather than just, you know, creating money for mortgages.
Yeah. I think Hashbury's suggested, I'd love it was a suggestion, Hashbury, if you wanted to watch that again and actually do that mind map that you suggested, but you could just kind of see how everything was tied together. You know, it wasn't just this would be good if we do that. Bob's able to see the impact it would have on all the other sectors. And as I highlighted on the banners that we put up there, he talks about the importance of ownership. And I think a lot of the transformation of the economy that you see is things like, how do communities earn a revenue from someone else's ownership? For example, if you're thinking about the just transition, and Bob's saying, well, actually ownership is the key thing. It's not wages, it's ownership. And again, I think that leads into financial services as well. It's actually owning the banks rather than just seeing what they can do for us. So really fascinating stuff from Bob. Any final comments? It'd be great to hear what you think.
I think that also this thing about limited liability, you know, as I pointed out to him about currency as an organism, and I'm thinking about it and comparing it with AI, you know, I guess currency is the 5,000-year-old AI. You know, when it goes out into the world, it can make things happen. Mm-hmm. And I think for far too long, people have been given the opportunity to just let their money go out and be free. And as long as it's bringing them a return, they haven't paid much attention to what it's been out doing in the world.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And, you know, 80% of the money that's created in our economy, according to the Bank of England, is created by private banks. You know, so we always hear so much about the other 20%, which is government created money or horizontal money. You know, we hear about it being printed and creating inflation. We never hear anything like that for the 80% of the other money that's in our society. So you can see, you know, there's a lot of rules for one part of the economy that don't seem to exist for the other part. Well, that was a fascinating interview. We've got a brilliant show coming up next on Independence Live, so I'd encourage you to stay on. That's the I Matter show with Martin Day and John McNally. So please stay on for that. It's really good fun. And we've got a session, our next episode in a couple of weeks' time. It's the economics of the climate crisis with Steve Keen. And I think it's fair to say that Steve's got an equally large brain as Bob Hockett. And Hashbury, if you want to jump back on and do a mind map for Steve Keen's session as well, would be delighted. Thanks so much for joining us. Our article covering that in a little bit more detail, slightly more relevant to Scotland's out via the National tomorrow. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.